Chapter 9. A Visit Among the Indians of Lake Winnebago. On Monday, the 31st of January, Mr. and Mrs. Whitney and myself left Green Bay on an excursion to Lake Winnebago, a distance of about 35 miles. The winters in this climate are, I am told, singularly mild for its latitude, about 45 degrees north. At all events, this present winter of 1836-7 has been surpassingly delightful. Since the commencement of the new year, we have had no storms with one or two slight exceptions and very little wind, but we have had a continuous succession of days bringing bright, pure, soft, exhilarating weather. The morning on which we commenced our short journey was one of them. We had Old Gray, Mr. Whitney's favorite steed, to draw us, and being warmly wrapped in buffalo robes, and having a box well laden with provisions, we feared neither cold or hunger, notwithstanding the scarcity of houses of entertainment in this western wild. We took our course upon the Fox River for the first 15 miles, pausing only in our course to call for a few moments at the house of the Indian Episcopal preacher, Mr. Williams. He was absent at the East, but his wife, a very tall and dignified and commanding figure, dressed becomingly in the American costume, received us very friendly and graciously. She seems quite like the well-bred lady, has excellent teeth, and I should scarcely have supposed her of the Indian race had I not been previously apprised of it. We dined at Wright's, the only public house in the whole journey. It is kept by Vermonters, and when I ascertained this fact, I became very sociable with the landlady, feeling as if she was one of my own clan. She said it used to be a matter of considerable interest to see travelers from her own state and mountain, but it had become a matter of such frequent occurrence that it almost ceased to affect her. After a dinner of salt pork, turnips, potatoes, and bread and butter, which I suppose is considered sumptuous fare in the wilderness, we resumed our seats in the sleigh and proceeded onwards. Our path for the remaining 20 miles lay through the primal forests. A road had been cut this past year by the troops. The stumps of large trees remained in the middle and scattered about in every part of it, but these are now chiefly covered by the snow as to render the traveling just about rough enough for a dyspeptic. Not a habitation is to be seen in all the distance, and we rode on and on, mile after mile, the tall forest on each side of us wailing our path in an endless succession of majesty and grace and beauty. The trees here are much more lofty and magnificent than in New England, and as the lordly oaks rise hundreds of feet above you, overshadowing your path and seeming to cut you off from all intercourse with created intelligences, when you look around in vain for some pause to the illimitable extent or some outlet to its oppressive solitude, there is a sense of grandeur and sublimity almost painful. Thus we journeyed on for 20 miles without meeting a human form, excepting in one solitary vehicle, which contained, like our own, 2 or 3 passing travelers. It was nightfall before we reached the mission house of the Stockbridge tribe of Indians, where we proposed to encroach upon the hospitality of strangers and pass the night in default of a public inn. Mr. Marsh, the missionary, a Presbyterian clergyman, was absent, but we were received very kindly by Mr. Hall, the teacher of the school, and his wife. Old Mrs. Hotchkiss, the mother of Mrs. Hall, and her granddaughter Clarissa, our companion to the lakes, were there, so that we did not feel as if among entire strangers. We were wearied with our day's ride, and after the accustomed worship of the family, we retired to rest among those children of the forest, to instruct them in learning and religion. She lives entirely alone, confiding herself to the tender mercies of such as we call savages. Her manner towards her pupil is particularly gentle and affectionate. From this place we traversed about another mile of woodland, and entered the log cabin of another chief, and that less spacious than the first. On Tuesday morning I awoke with a strong predisposition to headache, but this did not prevent my accompanying Emmeline and Mr. Hall and visiting some of the Indians at their own habitations. We kept upon the high road about 2 miles, and then struck off into the trackless forest about a half a mile, till we reached a log dwelling of one of the chiefs of the nation. He was introduced to me as Mr. Maddoxon. He gave me his hand, seemingly gratified by the visit, and desired me to be seated. Then his wife and an aged squaw whose back was bowed from the weight of years came forward and extended the hand of welcome. The chief was a venerable old man, his hair flowing over his shoulders and white with age. He conversed intelligently and pleasantly, says he likes his present residence, but not quite as well as the one he left about 6 years since in New York. He speaks of the probability of another removal beyond the Mississippi, and he, I believe, favors the enterprise. He was clad like an American and spoke English intelligibly. He says there is a tradition among their tribe that many years ago, while they had their home in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, there was a book in their possession greatly venerated, and which had been handed down from generation to generation, that all knowledge of the language in which it was written having passed away, it becoming incomprehensible to all their tribe, it was at length buried in the grave of their oldest chief. Many, many years after this, as one of them was digging in the earth, fragments of it were disinterred, and upon being exhibited to Dr. West, a missionary among the Stockbridge nation, it was found to contain verses and parts of the Exodus and Genesis of a Hebrew Bible. I am inclined to think it is a favorable hypothesis with the old chief that the Indians are descendants of the once favored children of God, the ancient Israel. His dwelling is of logs compactly laid together and plastered between with mud. On one side of the center is a wall of stone about 4 feet wide, against which is built an immense wood fire. A hole in the roof serves as an outlet for the smoke, and suspended from it are 2 chains which serve the purpose of a crane to hang their kettles on. From his dwelling we entered another under the same roof, where a school of Indian children is taught by one of our young American women, a Miss Lee. She is a New Englander and a Methodist, who has left her home and friends to come and dwell. We found the wife of the chief alone, apparently engaged in reading the Word of God. It was an affecting spectacle to see one of these, from whom our earliest infancy we have shrunk from with terror, who have been always pictured in our imagination wielding the tomahawk and the scalping knife, sitting quietly and meekly by her bedside with the gospel of love upon her lap. I stretched forth my hand to the old woman to give her the clasp of Christian friendship, remembering that we are all one in Jesus Christ. Her husband soon entered and received us with a benevolent welcome as he introduced by the name of Mr. Chicks. He talked intelligently and piously, said that most of the tribe were communicants in the church and were in the habit of praying morning and evening in their families. We thus visited 3 or 4 other habitations, all built in the same fashion and scattered about in the pathless wild. My fear of the Indian character gave place to sympathy and affection. I found them possessing great simplicity, integrity, and kindness. One of them said to my sister, "I didn't think Mrs. Whitney would humble herself so much as to visit me." "God is no respecter of persons," I replied. The tears started in her eyes as she said, "But everybody does not think of that." On our way back to the mission, we called at the small church in which the principal school is taught. It contains in all 72 scholars. We heard many of the Indian children read and spell, which they did with great correctness and facility. Their writing books were also exhibited, and some specimens of the rudiments of arithmetic. I was surprised at the neatness and beauty of the writing of some of these young savages. Mr. Hall exhibited to us an immense folio Bible in 2 volumes with an inscription from the donor on the first page, purporting to be the pious gift of the Reverend Dr. Francis Ascough, Clerk of the Closet to His Royal Highness Frederick, Prince of Wales, for the use of the congregation at or near Housatonic in a vast wilderness part of New England, who are at present under the voluntary care and instruction of the learned and religious Dr. John Sargent, and is to remain to the successors of those Indians from generation to generation as a testimony of the said doctor's great regard for the salvation of their souls. It is dated at London, 1745. It is interesting and singular to reflect how many changes have passed over this country and this unhappy race in a brief space of less than a century. Since this Bible came into their possession, the vast wilderness has become a cultivated and courtly region, and the persecuted congregations have been driven like hunted deer from place to place until the fainting remnant have reached the extreme limits of civilization and are here collecting strength for a brief space to migrate beyond the Mississippi. Some few years since a clergyman, now in the Episcopal Church, being in this region of country, visited the Stockbridge tribe of Indians at Statesburg, previous to their last removal. He entered with the great interest into the statistics of their people, and afterwards, during a visit to England, gave some account of them, mentioning the Bible which had been presented so many years since from that country. This account was translated into German and fell under the eye of German prince, who became so interested in it that he sent 12 beautiful Bibles to the Stockbridge nation, in one of which is a splendid quarto edition, was the following inscription: Charles Landgrave of Hesfield Marshal, General and Stassholder to His Majesty of the King of Denmark, of the Duchies of Selswick and Holstein, President of the Bible Societies of both duchies, to his Christian brethren, the Stockbridge Indians, Fox River sends greetings. Dear brother in Jesus Christ, our Lord God and Savior, I send you in his holy name these 12 Bibles, which I beg you to accept as proof of the brotherly interest which I so warmly take in your timely and eternal welfare. I beg you always to keep this Bible in remembrance of me, your friend and brother in Jesus Christ, and when you find an occasion to give in his holy name to other friendly tribes, a Bible which can lead them to the blessing of the knowledge of Jesus Christ, to the glory of his Almighty Father, so I beg you to distribute the remainder in my name. Charles L. of Hesse, Louisenland of Selswick, August 1835. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Whitney took leave of us, and with an Indian boy to accompany him on foot. While he rode on horseback, he went right through the woods where perhaps human footsteps never passed before. 35 miles through the deep snow to Sheboygan in order to hunt up lands for the sake of making himself a little more wealth. When will mankind learn to be rich towards God, rich in faith and in good works? Despite an aching head, Emmeline and myself soon after entered our sleigh and with Mr. Hall set out to go about 9 miles to the Brothertown settlements of Indians. We rode on in the traveled path, the forest assuming a still more gigantic and lofty aspect, as we journeyed westwardly until we reached the settlement, and here we turned off and wound our sinuous course among the overshadowing trees, our path indicated only by a single trail. Above and around us, and as far as the eye could penetrate, was the immeasurable forest. The huge trunks, standing singly in their uniform in regular succession, looked like pillars to some vast cathedral, while the interlacing and graceful branches, stripped of their foliage, were grouped in more beautiful proportions than may be seen in human architecture. Arch after arch, molded in Gothic forms, rested upon the massy columns in grand perspective, and the light, pure snow which had fallen during the night wore the semblance of wreathen and graceful ornaments upon their beautiful entablatures. The sun, as it approached the zenith, came shining in its strength, giving to the frost work of the forest 1,000 brilliant and sparkling coruscations like the tremulous and varied glitter of pendant chandeliers, and as the eye wandered through the avenues and colonnades of its grand and imposing scenery, I could but view it as a magnificent temple, built by nature and consecrated to the God of nature, its vast pillars and aisles resounding with the hymns of aerial worshippers and sealed with the pure and pearly heavens, whose roof was meet, flooring for the light treadings of happy angels. As we pursued our way through the devious windings, I could not wonder that the red man so loves his home upon the primitive and untortured earth. We had lost our trail and were now pressing upon snows whose virgin whiteness, purity, had never been sullied by the touch of man. As far as the eye could see, there was no work of human hand, but nature was all around us in her attractive forms, her melancholy music, and her gentle and poetic teachings. I felt that I could listen to her forever if she would always come in so bright an aspect. My meditations were soon ended by an approach to the pigsty of Mr. Abner, one of the most enterprising and thrifty of the Brothertown Indians. We entered his dwelling. It was much in the style of Stockbridge's. Mrs. Abner seemed a notable housewife, and the whole tribe of Brothertown, so far as my observation extends, are much more nearly assimilated to the whites than other Indians. They have lost their own language and speak ours only. They are less religious than the Stockbridges and far more superstitious. They have an old squaw among them whom they call a mother in the church, and to her they look up with great veneration. She prohibits prayer and other visible means of grace, placing much dependence upon the direct manifestations of the Spirit. After leaving Mr. Abner's and returning to the main road, we passed by another road over fields and through fences to the school of the settlement. It is taught by a Miss Ingram, a very pretty, fair-haired, blue-eyed American damsel who has forsaken all to dwell among the Indians and teach their children. I suspect she is the only white person in the whole settlement. She boards in an Indian family and has abandoned herself wholly to the sweet charity of doing good. Her school consists of about 40 boys and girls, and some of the former as large as she is. She had on a pair of men's boots, by the help of which, added to much zeal and perseverance, she had succeeded in wading through the deep snows between her lodgings and schoolhouse. After hearing her scholars a few moments, we returned to our sleigh and rode to Mr. Dick's, the boarding place of Miss Ingram. This family occupy a more comfortable tenement than any Indian habitation we have seen, having a regular chimney, a flight of stairs, and one bedroom occupied by Miss Ingram, partitioned off from the rest of the establishment. The old lady, Mrs. Dick, received us very cordially, kindly relieved us from our many outer garments, and gave us permission to eat some of the provision we had brought with us, inviting us at the same time to partake of something which she should prepare. This we declined, and after sitting about an hour, in which time, by questions, etc., I satisfied myself that the brother towns had made greater advances in the useful arts than any other Indian tribe, we took our leave. They are like us in language and dress, and more nearly allied in complexion and manners than the other children of the forest. On our return to the mission house at Stockbridge, we stopped once more at the little church to attend a concert of the Indians. They were singing away in full chorus when we entered. They sang English hymns with great harmony and sweetness. About 50 were assembled, men, women, and children, the men with their colored leggings wrought tastefully with beads, their moccasined feet and blanket coats tied about them with a wampum belt, the women with their moccasins, legging, scant broadcloth, petticoat, and white blanket placed under the beaver hat, and descending from the head over the neck and shoulders, enveloping almost the whole form, while the little papooses, bound upon their wooden cradles, formed altogether a picturesque assembly. Their musical powers had been much more successfully cultivated than I could have imagined. Their leader, who was of the same tribe, held a pitch pipe in his hand by which he modulated his own voice and gave the lead to others. He kept time for them with his hands, and they sang many hymns or parts of hymns in perfect accordance and with great sweetness. After the singing was concluded, the teacher of the school rose and opened a letter which he said he was requested to read. It was written by the Oneida Indian, giving an account of the sudden and violent death of one of the Stockbridge tribe at Duck Creek, the Oneida settlement, in consequence of being thrown violently against the house by his own cattle. He was a pious man and had died peacefully, commending the religion of Jesus to his brethren with his dying breath. After Mr. Hall had closed the letter, an Indian who stood back of the others on an elevated platform rose. He attempted to speak in his native tongue, but his breast heaved convulsively. Deep sobs choked his utterance, and the big tears rolled over his swarthy features. He covered his face with his hands, and for a few moments yielded up his soul to emotion. Afterwards he went on in the deep guttural sounds of the Indian dialect. He was frequently obliged to stop from excess of feeling. Deep seriousness pervaded every countenance, but I saw none moved to weeping but himself, and I was unprepared to see the exhibition of sensibility in the stern stoicism of the North American Indian. After he had finished his address, he seated himself and, bowing his head upon his hands, abandoned himself to the current of his grief. He was not a relative of the deceased, but merely a neighbor. He was followed by the aged Metoxen, the pious chief, who addressed the audience in a few brief sentences. When he had concluded, one present threw himself on his knees and poured out his soul in a prayer full of apparent feeling and devotion, but in a language I could not comprehend. The scene had been to me one of deep solemnity and affecting interest. To see these persecuted children of the forest not only advancing in the arts of civilization and the comforts of life, learning to read and write our own language, but to think of them as the unhappy and persecuted and despised seed of Israel, singing the songs of Zion in a strange land, and offering heartfelt petitions to the once unknown and unacknowledged Jesus of Nazareth, was indeed touching and delightful. I could but be grateful for what God hath wrought, and for the wonders that he doeth among the children of men. On Thursday morning it was so cold as to be deemed imprudent for us to cross the lake, and we therefore concluded to set our faces homewards. Mr. and Mrs. Hall and Clarissa accompanied our journeyings in another sleigh, and Mr. Nichols, the Methodist minister, took Mr. Whitney's place in ours. We journeyed on well over heavy road until we got within 8 miles of home, and poor old Gray began to grow weary with this pilgrimage. In vain we urged and coaxed and whipped. Old Gray went heavily, and we began to fear his limbs would fail entirely, and Mr. Whitney be obliged to take up with Fitzjames' lament a little varied. A little thought when first thy locks I combed upon the banks of Hocks, that the wild Indian e'er should feed on thy fleet limbs my matchless steed. Woe worth the ride, woe worth the day, that cost thy life, my poor old Gray. By dint of patience and perseverance, we walked him home at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and found friends all well, but supposing us safely ensconced on the borders of Lake Winnebago, when we have even not yet had a glimpse of it.
The diary of Elizabeth Henshaw Platt ends abruptly with her arrival back in Green Bay from visiting the Winnebago Indians. There is no mention of the length of her visit or of her return journey back to Vermont.